Look, ma'am, with all due respect, this is the Centurion Gate. This isn't the PX. The access roster is the roster, and your name isn't on it. So, if you don't mind, step aside and let the real soldiers through. The crowd of tired, dusty infantrymen chuckled, a low ripple of amusement in the oppressive afternoon heat of forward operating base Kestrel. Sergeant Rex Miller, a man built like the concrete barriers he guarded, leaned against the Hesco wall with a practiced, dismissive arrogance. He gestured with a thumb, a full head taller than the woman standing before him. She remained perfectly still, her posture relaxed, but not slumped, a study in neutral composure. Her uniform was standard issue, faded by the same relentless sun that bleached everything in this valley, and bore no discernible rank or unit patches, only a simple name tape that read Sharma. She didn't flinch, didn't sigh, didn't offer a single flicker of indignation. Her gaze was steady, not on Miller's smug face, but over his shoulder, scanning the distant, shimmering ridgeline with an unnerving, analytical calm. But when the base commander, Colonel Thorne, observing the daily traffic from the command post tower through a pair of Steiner binoculars, saw her stance, the precise, balanced distribution of her weight, the way her hands rested naturally near where a sidearm would be, a posture he hadn't seen since his own days in selection, his blood ran cold. He knew that stance. It was the calm before a storm of terrifying competence. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, type competence below. The silence that followed Sergeant Miller's pronouncement was thick and expectant, a pocket of manufactured drama in the mundane flow of base life. The other soldiers in the queue, waiting to re-enter the wire after a patrol, shifted their weight, their amusement at Miller's bravado mixing with a mild curiosity. They saw what Miller saw, a woman of slight build, whose fatigue seemed a size too large, her face smudged with dust and sweat, making her look more like a misplaced logistics clerk than anyone who would have business at the primary tactical entry point. Her equipment was Spartan and scrupulously clean, but was also utterly unremarkable. A standard M4, carried with an easy familiarity that could have been either years of practice or simple habit. A pack that was neatly squared away but bore the scuffs and scrapes of hard use. Nothing about her screamed elite. Nothing whispered danger. And in the rigid, visual hierarchy of the military, where every patch, pin, and piece of gear tells a story, her deliberate lack of ornamentation made her a blank page, and Sergeant Miller was more than happy to write his own assumptions all over it. He crossed his arms, the thick muscles of his forearms straining against the rolled-up sleeves of his uniform. Problème, Mom? Did you not hear me? The line's getting long. People got places to be, reports to file. You're holding up the war effort. His voice dripped with a condescending patience that was far more insulting than outright anger. He was performing, playing the role of the gruff but fair gatekeeper for his audience. Sharma's response was to slowly, methodically, reach into her cargo pocket. Her movements were fluid, economical, devoid of any wasted energy. There was no frustration in the gesture, no hurried searching. It was the same deliberate precision a surgeon might use to select an instrument. She produced a folded, laminated set of orders. The plastic yellowed and cracked at the edges from being opened and closed 1,000 times. She held it out. Miller didn't take it. He glanced at it, a smirk playing on his lips. Paperwork. Fantastic. Everyone's got paperwork. Half the generals in this country have paperwork saying they own this base. Doesn't mean they're on the Centurion Gate access list. That list is curated. For a reason. It's about operational security. He was digging in, doubling down on his initial judgment, his ego now fully invested in the confrontation. He saw her silence not as strength, but as weakness. He saw her calm not as discipline, but as uncertainty. He was a man who understood the world through volume and spectacle, and she was providing neither. Her quiet refusal to be provoked was, to him, the most provoking thing of all. He was making a mistake of catastrophic proportions, a mistake born from the lazy arrogance of a man who believed his eyes could tell him everything he needed to know about the world. He was judging a book by its cover, unaware that the cover was intentionally blank and the story inside was written in blood, shadow, and a level of professionalism he couldn't possibly comprehend. The first explosion was not a bang, but a deep, resonant whump that seemed to press the air out of the lungs of everyone at the gate. It was the unmistakable sound of a heavy mortar round impacting, close enough for the shockwave to kick up a curtain of sand and gravel 50 yards away, near the perimeter fence. Instantly, the lazy afternoon atmosphere shattered. The laughter died in the soldiers' throats, replaced by the sharp, metallic clang of weapons being readied. Miller, for all his bluster, was a trained soldier. He spun around, his eyes wide, screaming into his radio. "Contact! Mortar impact, northeast quadrant. All posts sound an alarm. Centurion is under." His words were cut off by a second, sharper crackle. Not a mortar. This was the high-velocity report of a sniper rifle, and it came from the ridgeline Sharma had been watching so intently. The round impacted with a sickening thud into the concrete barrier just above Miller's head, showering him with chips of stone and dust. Panic, cold and electric, began to set in. The soldiers in the line scrambled for cover, their training kicking in but laced with the adrenaline of a surprise attack. Then came the third element of the assault, the one that showed this was a sophisticated, coordinated attack. From a concealed position on the opposite side of the road, a heavy machine gun opened up, its rhythmic, hammering fire stitching a deadly line across the gate's defenses, pinning everyone down. They were caught in a classic L-shaped ambush, pinned by machine gun fire, targeted by sniper, and bracketed by mortars. It was a kill box. In that moment of chaos, as trained soldiers devolved into a state of reactive survival, Sharma moved. She didn't dive for cover. She didn't scream. She simply dropped to one knee, her body sinking below the line of fire with an almost supernatural grace. Her eyes, which had been calm and observational, now burned with an intense, focused light. The blank page was gone. In her place was something ancient and lethal. Her hands moved with a blur of efficiency that was breathtaking to behold. She dropped the folded orders into the dust, her left hand already unslinging her rifle, while her right stripped a fresh magazine from her vest. The empty magazine was ejected, and a full one seated with a single, seamless motion that made no sound other than a quiet, authoritative click. She didn't look for orders. She didn't wait for Miller to recover his senses. She became the calm center of the storm, a node of pure, undiluted competence in a world that had suddenly dissolved into noise and fear. She was no longer a person. She was a function, a problem solver. And the problem in front of her was a complex and deadly equation that she was already beginning to solve. Miller, pressed against the barrier, his face pale, fumbled with his radio, trying to give a coherent situation report. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw her. He saw the transformation. He saw the woman he had dismissed, the clerk he had belittled, moving with a purpose that dwarfed his own frantic actions. He saw her raise the rifle to her shoulder, her cheek finding the stock in a perfect practiced weld. He saw her take a single, steadying breath. And in that frozen moment of disbelief, he realized that the most dangerous person at the Centurion Gate wasn't the sniper on the hill or the machine gunner in the ditch. It was the quiet woman he had just pushed aside. Her first action was not to fire, but to listen. In the cacophony of incoming fire and panicked shouts, Sharma closed her eyes for a single, fractional second. She isolated the sounds. The deep, percussive thump of the mortar tube firing. The sharp, supersonic crack of the sniper round passing overhead. The heavy, rhythmic chugging of the machine gun. She processed the cadence, the timing, the direction. In less than 2 seconds, she had built a complete, three-dimensional map of the enemy's positions and firing cycle in her mind. She knew the sniper was approximately 800 meters out, positioned on the high ground to act as an overwatch and spotter for the mortars. She knew the machine gun was closer, maybe 150 meters, dug into a wadi to provide suppressing fire. And she knew the mortar team was hidden behind a false crest, using the sniper's corrections to walk their rounds onto the base. This was not a random barrage. It was a deliberate, tactical siege. Opening her eyes, She turned to the nearest soldier, a young private whose face was a mask of terror. She didn't shout. Her voice was low, impossibly calm, yet it cut through the noise like a razor. "You, give me your en-bloc clip." Now the private stared at her, uncomprehending. "What?" Sharma didn't repeat herself. She simply reached over, her hand a blur, and deftly unclipped the small, advanced targeting module from the private's helmet. It was an M210, a piece of high-tech gear that networked thermal, night vision, and target designation into a single heads-up display. To the private, it was a complicated piece of equipment he barely knew how to use. To Sharma, it was an extension of her will. She clipped it onto her own rifle's rail system, her fingers flying across the small control pad, syncing it to her weapon's optics. The entire process took less than 5 seconds. While Miller was still trying to get a clear signal on his radio, Sharma was already preparing her counterattack. She pointed to 2 other soldiers huddled behind a burned-out truck. "You two, suppressing fire on that waddy. You're 1 o'clock. Short, controlled bursts. Don't waste ammo. Just make him keep his head down." Her voice held an authority that was absolute and unquestionable. It wasn't the authority of rank. It was the authority of pure, undeniable competence. The soldiers, desperate for direction, complied instantly, their rifles barking in response. The incoming machine gun fire faltered for a moment as the gunner was forced to take cover. That was the window she needed. Sharma brought her rifle up, the M210 display flaring to life in her optic. She wasn't aiming at the machine gunner. That was a distraction. She was aiming at the source of the problem, the sniper on the ridgeline. Through the powerful scope, she could see him, a faint shimmer of heat in the rocks. An impossible shot for most. A distance that required complex calculations for windage, elevation, and bullet drop. But Sharma wasn't most people. She took another deep, controlled breath, letting half of it out. Her body became as still as the rocks around her. The world narrowed to the glowing reticle in her scope and the heat signature of the man who thought he was safe. She didn't just pull the trigger. She pressed it, a slow, deliberate squeeze, becoming one with the rifle. The shot was a single, clean crack that was almost lost in the surrounding chaos. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, 800 meters away, the heat signature on the ridgeline vanished. The deadly, accurate sniper fire ceased instantly. The mortar rounds, now blind, stopped falling. In the sudden, deafening silence that followed, broken only by the sporadic fire of the 2 soldiers she had directed, every head at the gate slowly turned towards her. Miller stared, his jaw hanging open, his radio forgotten in his hand. He had just witnessed an act of marksmanship that shouldn't have been possible with a standard-issue rifle, under fire in a matter of seconds. It was a shot that legends were made of, and it had come from the small, unassuming woman he had tried to humiliate. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned in a single, perfectly executed moment of impossible precision. The collective shock at the gate was a palpable thing, a physical presence as thick as the dust settling in the air. The 2 soldiers she had ordered to lay down, suppressing fire, slowly ceased, their barrels smoking, their eyes wide as they stared first at the silent ridgeline and then back at Sharma. She was already moving, her focus absolute. The immediate, existential threat from the sniper and mortars was gone, but the machine gunner was still a problem. With the same unnerving calm, she unclipped the M210 module and handed it back to the stunned private. "Thanks for the loan," she said, her voice a flat, neutral tone, as if she were returning a borrowed pen. She then turned her attention to Miller, who was still leaning against the barrier, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a woman, not a clerk, but a weapon. "Sergeant," she said, and the simple title was now imbued with an iron authority that made him stand up straight. "Get on your radio. Report a coordinated attack. 3 elements. Sniper neutralized. Mortar position is blind but still active. Recommend counter-battery fire on these coordinates." She rattled off a 10-digit grid coordinate from memory, a location she had pinpointed in her mind based on the trajectory and sound of the incoming rounds. The remaining element is a heavy machine gun, pinned down in the wadi at my 1 o'clock. I'm going to flank it. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. Before Miller could even process the words, she was moving, hugging the line of concrete barriers, her profile impossibly low, her movements a fluid dance of kinetic efficiency. She flowed from cover to cover, not with the frantic scramble of a frightened soldier, but with the patient, predatory grace of a hunter. The remaining machine gunner, likely confused by the sudden silence from his overwatch, let out a long, searching burst, spraying bullets across the gate area. But Sharma was already gone, a ghost in the swirling dust, using the noise and chaos as her own personal camouflage. From the command post tower, Colonel Thorne had watched the entire engagement unfold through his binoculars. He had seen the sniper round impact near Miller. He had seen the soldiers scatter, and he had seen the lone, anonymous figure move with a chilling economy of motion. He had zoomed in on her, watching her attach the targeting module, watching her perfectly still form as she took the shot. When the sniper fire ceased, Thorne lowered his binoculars, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He knew. He didn't know her name, but he knew what she was. There were only a handful of people in the entire United States military who could make a shot like that, under those conditions, with that equipment. They were phantoms, whispered about in classified briefings and after-action reports. They didn't wear fancy uniforms or collect rows of medals. Their greatest weapon was the very anonymity that had led Sergeant Miller to his foolish assumption. Thorne turned to his communications officer, his voice a low growl of command. "Give me a personnel file. Name is Sharma. No rank, no unit. She just tried to enter Centurion Gate. And get the quick reaction force spun up. Tell them to follow the lead of the woman at the gate. She is now the on-scene commander." The officer stared at him, confused. "Sir? Which woman? We don't have a file for a Sharma on the base roster." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "Then check the Tier 1 transit logs. Check with SOCOM. I don't care who you have to call. Give me that file. That woman just saved half my men at that gate. And I want to know who the hell I'm sending my QRF to follow." The colonel's words hung in the air, a testament to the undeniable truth that had just been demonstrated in a single, perfect shot. Competence is its own authority. Colonel Thorne descended from the command tower with a purpose that made junior officers flatten themselves against the walls. He wasn't walking. He was storming, a vessel of righteous fury and profound respect. In his hand, he clutched a data pad, the screen glowing with the file he had finally managed to acquire after a series of increasingly heated calls to CENTCOM. He strode out towards the Centurion Gate, ignoring the medics who were now tending to the wounded and the engineers assessing the damage. The immediate crisis was over. Shortly after Sharma had vanished to flank the machine gun position, the gunner, now isolated and terrified, had surrendered to the approaching quick reaction force. The entire complex attack had been dismantled in under 3 minutes, primarily by the actions of one person. Thorne arrived at the gate to a scene of quiet awe. The soldiers who had been there stood in a loose, reverent circle. In the center stood Sharma. She was calmly checking her rifle, wiping the dust from the action with a small cloth, her focus entirely on her equipment. She looked up as the colonel approached, her expression as neutral and unreadable as ever. Sergeant Miller stood off to the side, his face ashen, his previous arrogance completely sandblasted away, leaving behind the raw, hollowed-out look of a man who has come face to face with his own monumental ignorance. He saw the colonel approaching and snapped to attention, but Thorne's eyes passed right over him as if he were a piece of furniture. The colonel stopped directly in front of Sharma. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply looked at her, his gaze taking in the faded uniform, the unassuming build, and the deep, steady calm in her eyes. He had seen the file. He had read the commendations, the mission logs, the after-action reports, so heavily redacted they were more black ink than text. He was standing in the presence of a living legend, a ghost who walked the lonely, violent frontiers of modern warfare, and she looked like someone who could get lost in a crowd. He finally broke the silence, his voice quiet but carrying across the entire area. Captain Sharma, it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement. Miller's head snapped up. Captain? The men around him shifted, murmuring in disbelief. Sharma simply nodded once. Sir, her reply was barely a whisper. Thorne held up the data pad, not for her to see, but for everyone else. I had to make a call to a 3-star general to get this file unsealed, Captain. I think the men here deserve to know who saved their lives today. He tapped the screen, and his voice took on a formal, declamatory tone, as if he were reading a citation. Name, Anya Sharma. Rank, Captain, United States Army. Unit, 7th Special Operations Group. Echo Detachment. A wave of shock rolled through the assembled soldiers. Echo Detachment wasn't just special forces. It was the quietest, most classified, most lethally effective direct action unit in the theater of operations. They were the ghosts. They were the people you called when a situation was completely lost. They didn't exist except in the nightmares of their enemies and the grateful prayers of the people they saved. Thorne continued, his voice like stones dropping into a deep well, each word landing with immense weight. He paced slowly in front of the assembled soldiers, his eyes locked on Miller, who seemed to shrink with every syllable. Combat hours, classified, but the log shows over 4,000 hours operating in non-permissive environments. That's more than most battalions see in a decade. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. 4,000 hours of active combat, hidden behind a face that looked like it belonged behind a desk. Medals, Silver Star. Bronze Star with V4 Valor, 3 oak leaf clusters. Purple Heart, 2 clusters. He stopped reading from the list of official awards and looked up, his gaze sweeping over the men. But those are just the ones they can talk about. The real list, the one that matters, is written in black ink on pages none of us are clear to see. He took a step closer to Miller, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. Mission classifications, Tier 1 Operator. Advanced Special Operations Techniques. Hostage Rescue. Counterterrorism. Expert in long-range marksmanship, unconventional warfare, and close-quarters combat. He turned back to Sharma, and his entire demeanor shifted. The anger vanished, replaced by a profound, almost reverent respect. He stood straight, his back rigid, and executed the sharpest, most formal salute of his long and distinguished career. It was not the salute of a superior officer to a subordinate. It was the salute of one warrior to another, an acknowledgement of a skill and sacrifice that transcended rank. Captain Sharma, he said, his voice ringing with sincerity, you are an honor to this uniform. Your actions today were in the highest traditions of the military service. You saved this gate. You saved these men. He held the salute, waiting. Sharma, who had stood impassively through the entire recitation of her own legendary career, simply gave a short, precise nod. Just doing my job. Colonel, the simplicity of her words was more powerful than any boast. Thorne finally dropped his salute. He then turned his full, undivided attention back to Sergeant Miller. The silence stretched, becoming agonizing. Miller's face was slick with sweat. He looked from the colonel to the captain, the reality of his blunder crashing down on him with the force of a physical blow. He had not just disrespected a soldier. He had insulted and obstructed one of the most elite operators on the entire continent. He had stood on the shore and mocked a tsunami, utterly oblivious to the power hidden beneath the calm surface. Sergeant Miller, Thorne said, his voice deceptively soft, you are in charge of security at this gate. Your primary responsibility is to discern friend from foe, to assess threats. Today, you demonstrated a catastrophic failure in that responsibility. You confused arrogance with authority. You confused appearance with reality. You looked at a guardian and saw an obstacle. He let the words hang in the air, a public indictment of the sergeant's deepest failure. You owe Captain Sharma not just an apology, but your life. And you will learn from this. We will all learn from this. The lesson was clear, etched into the shocked faces of every soldier present. Never, ever assume. True competence doesn't carry a banner. It carries a rifle, and it gets the job done while others are still talking. The story of what happened at the Centurion Gate spread through FOB Kestrel not like wildfire, but like a shockwave. It traveled through the hushed conversations in the Chow Hall, the encrypted messages between command posts, and the late-night gossip in the barracks. It was a modern military fable, a cautionary tale that stripped away the comfort of assumptions. The narrative was simple and devastatingly effective. The loudmouthed gate guard and the quiet, unassuming woman who turned out to be a ghost of special operations. The tale had all the elements of a legend, a moment of public humiliation, a sudden, violent crisis, an act of impossible skill, and a final, crushing vindication. Within 48 hours, every soldier on the base, from the lowest private to the highest-ranking officer, knew the name Sharma. They knew about the 800-meter shot. They knew about the flanking maneuver. And most importantly, they knew that Sergeant Miller, the symbol of petty authority, had been publicly humbled by a living embodiment of quiet professionalism. Miller himself became a changed man. He was not formally punished, as Colonel Thorne believed the public humiliation was a far more effective and lasting corrective. The sergeant lost his swagger. The arrogant lean was gone, replaced by a rigid, formal posture. He spoke less, and when he did, it was with a newfound humility. He was often seen at the firing range, long after his shift ended, practicing, striving for a level of competence he now understood he had never truly possessed. A week after the incident, several soldiers witnessed a quiet, remarkable scene. Captain Sharma was passing through the gate on her way out of the wire, leading a small, equally unassuming team of operators. Miller, who was on duty, snapped to attention and rendered a salute so sharp and sincere it seemed to pain him. He didn't say a word. Sharma paused, looked him in the eye, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement before melting into the landscape outside the base. It was a silent exchange, but it spoke volumes. It was an apology accepted, a lesson learned. The event also prompted tangible changes. Colonel Thorne instituted a new training module for all personnel on the base, focused on threat identification beyond the obvious. The core of the training was the story of Captain Sharma at the gate, which was now officially referred to in training documents as the Centurion Incident. The lesson was hammered home. Do not judge by rank, gender, or appearance. Judge by action, by composure, by competence. A photograph of the bullet impact on the concrete barrier above where Miller had been standing was framed and hung in the main briefing room. Beneath it, a small brass plaque was installed. It didn't mention Miller or Sharma by name. It simply read, "Assumptions are a luxury we cannot afford." The location of the incident became its own landmark. Soldiers started referring to the stretch of road in front of the gate as the Sharma line, the invisible boundary where arrogance had been met and decisively defeated by skill. It served as a constant, physical reminder that the most dangerous threats and the most powerful allies often come in the most unexpected packages. The legend of Captain Sharma's stand at the gate endured long after she and her team had moved on to other, darker corners of the war. It became part of the institutional memory of FOB Kestrel, a foundational story told to new arrivals to impress upon them the base's core ethos. The story was a perfect teaching tool. It was a stark reminder that the battlefield does not care about ego. It does not reward prejudice. It rewards only one thing: performance. The tale was stripped down and polished with each retelling. The essential truths burnished until they shone. The arrogant sergeant, the quiet captain, the impossible shot, the humbling reveal. It became a parable about the difference between perceived power and actual power. Perceived power was loud, brittle, and built on the weak foundation of superficial judgment. Actual power was silent, resilient, and built on the bedrock of disciplined, practiced, and proven competence. Sergeant Miller, who eventually made staff sergeant, became the most fervent evangelist of this lesson. He was the one who personally briefed all new gate guards, and he always ended his briefing by standing them in front of the patched concrete wall. He would point to the spot where the sniper round had nearly ended his life. "You see that?" he would say, his voice low and devoid of its old bluster. "That's the price of being wrong. I looked at a captain from the 7th Special Operations Group and saw a lost clerk. I let my ego write a check that my skills couldn't cash. She could have let me die. She could have watched this gate get overrun while I was making stupid jokes. But she didn't, because she is a professional, and a professional's only concern is the mission. Your job here isn't to feel important. It's to be competent. Remember that his story, a voluntary confession of his own foolishness, was more impactful than any training manual or PowerPoint slide. He had turned his greatest moment of shame into his most powerful teaching tool, ensuring that the lesson Captain Sharma had taught him would be paid forward. He was, in his own way, honoring her legacy. The legacy of quiet competence was not just in the stories, but in the subtle shift in the base's culture. There was a newfound respect for the quiet ones, for the soldiers who kept to themselves, who focused on their gear, who spoke only when they had something important to say. The base became a place where a soldier's worth was measured not by the volume of their voice, but by the steadiness of their hands and the clarity of their actions. Captain Sharma had never sought recognition. She had never asked for thanks. Her reward was a successful mission and the safety of those she was sworn to protect. She had left behind something more valuable than a medal or a plaque. She had left behind a lesson, burned into the memory of an entire military base, a lesson that would save more lives in the long run than her single, perfect shot. She had reinforced the most fundamental truth of her silent profession. Actions, in the end, are all that matter. A year later, FOB Kestrel was a different place. The perimeter was stronger, the defenses more sophisticated, and the soldiers who manned them were sharper, more vigilant. The Sharma line was now a permanent, painted line on the asphalt, a starting point for all incoming and outgoing patrols, a physical reminder of the standard of excellence. The story had become so ingrained in the base's culture that newcomers were tested on its details. The lesson had become doctrine. The quiet professional ethos had taken root, creating a culture where humility and skill were prized above all else. A young lieutenant, fresh from the academy and full of textbook knowledge, was observing the gate operations one afternoon. He watched a dusty, nondescript supply convoy being processed. He noticed one of the drivers, a small, quiet woman in grease-stained fatigues, expertly maneuvering her heavy truck with a precision that seemed out of place. The lieutenant turned to the gate NCO, who happened to be Staff Sergeant Miller. "Sergeant," the lieutenant said, a hint of condescension in his tone. "Shouldn't you be running a more thorough check on the civilian contractors?" She barely looked strong enough to turn the wheel on that thing. Miller stopped what he was doing and turned to face the young officer. He didn't get angry. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the lieutenant with the weary patience of a man who had learned his lesson the hard way. He pointed to the framed picture in the guardhouse, the one of the bullets guard wall. "Sir," Miller said, his voice level and firm. "With all due respect, around here, we've learned not to judge a person's strength by the size of their frame. We judge it by the quality of their work." The lieutenant, taken aback by the quiet authority in the NCO's voice, fell silent. He looked from Miller to the woman in the truck, who had just finished her maneuver and was now methodically checking her tire pressure, her movements efficient and sure. He looked at the plaque on the wall, and for the first time, he began to understand that his education was far from complete. The true legacy of a quiet professional isn't a story left behind. It's the standard that moves forward. It's the change in behavior, the elevation of competence, the death of ignorant assumption. Captain Sharma was a ghost, a name whispered in a story. But her impact was solid, tangible, and permanent. It was in the reinforced concrete of the walls, in the improved training of the soldiers, and most importantly, in the hard-won wisdom of a staff sergeant who now understood that respect is not demanded by a loud voice, but earned by a quiet, steady hand. Her legacy was in the silence, the calm, the professional focus that now defined the guardians of the Centurion Gate. The universe of human interaction is often dominated by the loudest voice in the room. We are conditioned to equate confidence with competence, volume with value. Arrogance builds its own stage, demands its own spotlight, and writes its own glowing reviews, often with little to back it up beyond the sheer force of its own self-belief. It is a fragile, hollow power, one that relies on the silence and complicity of others to maintain its illusion. But there exists another kind of power, a deeper and more resilient strength. It is the power of the quiet professional. It is a force that seeks no audience, requires no applause, and finds its validation not in the opinions of others, but in the flawless execution of a task. This is the quiet competence that builds, that protects, that achieves. It is the surgeon's steady hand in the operating room, the pilot's calm voice during a crisis, the soldier's unwavering focus in the face of chaos. It is the power that emerges when ego is stripped away, leaving only discipline, practice, and purpose. The story of Captain Sharma and Sergeant Miller is not just a tale about a soldier at a gate. It is a timeless parable about the fundamental collision between these two opposing forces. It is about the triumph of demonstrated skill over baseless prejudice, of silent action over empty words. Sergeant Miller represented the easy, lazy path of judgment based on superficialities, a mindset that infects institutions and stifles potential. Captain Sharma embodied the harder, more honorable path of earning respect through undeniable performance. Her silence was not weakness, it was a weapon. It was the calm sea that concealed an unfathomable depth of lethal capability. She did not need to announce her worth because her actions spoke with a clarity and finality that no boast ever could. This is the ultimate lesson. True strength does not need to shout. True respect is not given to the loudest, but to the most capable. In a world that constantly tempts us to judge by the cover, to listen to the most arrogant voice, we must learn to seek out and value the quiet professionals among us. They are the guardians at the gate, the pillars of our society, the ones who get the job done while others are merely talking about it. Their legacy is not written in headlines, but in the lives they save, the standards they set, and the lessons they teach through their quiet, unwavering example. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.